Chapter 17 of Psychopomp Drive. Written by Janeen Leese-Taylor. Read aloud by Skye Simaru. Chapter 17 Flash of Pink. People piled out of the buildings around them, swerving around the bright metal silhouettes of the animals that marked the zoo's entranceway. One of the flagpoles had been bent in two, the second one scorched black and missing its flag. And as the Amarini crossed into the enclosed space at the entrance to the Chester Zoo, it became clear that the situation was worse than they had first thought. Strewn around the car park were the countless shapes of the wounded and the dead. Medical staff moved from one body to the next, like bees jumping between flowers, their fluorescent uniforms as bright as a butterfly's wings. The thin, wisp-like presence of whisperers moved between the witnesses, spilling over the heads of mothers and schoolchildren like smoke. Finley couldn't quite catch their words, but he knew what they would be saying, spreading despair, fear, hopelessness. He watched the expressions on the onlookers warp and change with their influence. The Amarini moved separately from the living, the spell protecting them from being noticed even when brushing against the civilians. He wondered what the people would see in their place. Would it be a cat? A homeless man? A strange breeze meant to mimic a human's touch. Despite their proximity, the eyes of those around them never lingered on them for long. An older, bespectacled man was holding up a megaphone, leaning out from behind the cover of a parked police car. His once dark hair was beginning to transition to gray at the edges. His mustache and beard dotted with white, like snow on tarmac. Several armed officers had surrounded him like a protective wall, riot gear creating frightening outlines from their shapes. Ignoring their presence, Finley and the other spirits made their way in through the fleeing crowds, cat-like ears gathering intel where they could. He stopped as his feet met a solid object, the blood from the woman's body beginning to coat the bottom of his shoes where it leaked out of her prone form. "What about the wounded, Reich?" he asked the Amarini ahead of him. He knelt down beside her, reaching in to feel for a pulse. Weak and growing weaker by the second, her skin was like ice against the tips of his fingers. "They are not why we're here, Finn!" Reichardt called out from just ahead of him, his voice raised to be heard over the sounds of the corruptors' voices. "We need to leave them for the first responders! We aren't equipped to help them!" Finley ran a hand over the spot where the woman's clothes were torn, frowning down at the torn flesh he found there. "This wasn't done by a hollow," he noted with a frown. "This looks like she was attacked by an animal." Alvaro leaned over his shoulder and shook his head.
"He's right, Reich. Those are claw marks."
"Mon Dieu," Reichardt growled.
"You made Reich swear. That is definitely not good," Abby remarked.
"Does this mean that the animals have escaped?" Finley asked.
"More likely, the animals have purposely been released,"
Reichardt noted.
"Oh, yeah, definitely not good,"
Abby frowned. Beside them, a man in his mid-40s slowly peeled upwards from his body, the lost soul looking around with wide eyes, as the Amarini seemingly appeared before him. His mouth dropped open, hazel eyes staring, as Finley began to rise again, making room for the living medics to get through to the victim. Finley hoped that she would make it, but with wounds like that, who could be certain? He raised his head as the corruptors let out a roar of anguish, the various shapes billowing outwards as they became detached from the central mass. Reichardt moved to attack first, streaks of red fabric flashing by in the sparse sunlight as his blades found their mark. The hollows screamed, flying all directions as their hosts slumped to the ground again.
Amarini!
The Frenchman shouted, pulling his blades back for another strike.
Spread out! Clear the way for survivors!
A projectile blew past Finley's face as he charged forward, and he let out a shout of surprise as he skidded onto his side. More bullets launched into the air, and the large form of Alvaro rushed past, gripping Reichardt by his coat and flinging him back and out of their trajectory. Reichardt hit the ground beside him and rolled as Abby jumped in to take his place, spear embedding in one of the writhing puddles of screaming bile. She pierced through the thick sludge at its center, and the mass spread out across the ground to absorb the blow. Dozens of tiny black hands reached out to push her weapon back.
Jesus, these things just won't give up!
Abby grunted, working the blade free from the monster's grasp. The momentum of it carried her backwards across the wet grass at the car park's edge. Alvaro pulled out his hammer again and took out another chunk of hollows, watching as Finley leaped up to do the same, his axe slicing through the shadows and sending the droplets of their corpses spattering across the ground.
This is taking too long,
the older spirit grunted, his molars grinding together in frustration.
For every dozen we kill, there are even more piling out of that place.
We need to split up, Finley shouted. Cover more ground. Auron appeared by Finley's side with a toothy bone grin.
Allow me to lend a paw or two, my little kitties,
he crooned proudly, watching as 3 ghostly shapes began to form ahead of them. They took the shapes of pure white hounds, their eyes blue as the late morning skies overhead.
Go get 'em, girls.
The dogs charged headlong into the dark smoke, leaping from one target to the next in quick succession. Auron moved his hands to form unusual signs, holding them up towards his own targets.
I'll clear a path for you, Finley. Just wait for my word.
Got it, Finley answered, his reaper at the ready. The 3 beasts leaped in formation, spiraling around the swarming black masses and leading them away from the fleeing civilians.
The gift shop is just through there,
Auron hollered.
Go now before more of them come back.
Explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet, and Finley flung himself forward against the constant throng of people, throwing his hands out to save himself as he bounced off the sides of the main entrance. The disjointed cries of various species of animal filled the air with distress, and a rush of terror ran through Finley's every cell as bright flames lit up the building's interior. What was once a large room filled with toys and games was now black with ash and soot. Plushies that barely resembled animals anymore curled into themselves as if they, too, were hiding from the attackers. As Finley came out the other side, he stared open-mouthed at the sky above him. Like circling starlings, the hollows accumulated in the thousands overhead, blotting out the last of the light.
What the hell is going on?
He breathed. Something black and humanoid drifted down through the air with its hands outstretched, and hollows were pulled into its shape like a powerful magnet, spreading outwards in all directions until the shape could no longer be discerned. Sassy flared to life in his hands, purple magic glowing in the darkness.
I can hear more children trapped in there, Finn! We need to go help!
The Amarini swallowed, squeezing the wood until he could feel the burn of it against his calluses.
This is it. This is what we've trained for,
he thought with determination.
There's no turning back now. Let's go, Sassy,
he said aloud, and charged forward into the gloom.
I hope we're not already too late.
Another explosion sent dirt and debris flying through the air, and Finley raised his free hand to protect his eyes. He leaped over the blown-out guts of the gift shop, avoiding piles of discarded stuffed tigers and zoological-themed stationery. A young woman was cowering just outside the entranceway, with a baby in her arms, whispering a prayer into the top of its head as she rocked her body back and forth in comforting circles. The body of a security guard lay barely a meter outside of the shattered doorway, pinned to the ground by shelves and part of a wall that had collapsed in the blast. From this distance, it was difficult to tell if the man was alive or dead. The Amarini knew that he couldn't stop to help them, knew that this was a job that belonged to the paramedics and other first responders. It was only when a third explosion sent another wave of terrified tourists his way that he turned towards the problem again with his reaper in hand.
We can't get caught up on the dead. There are still survivors that need our help.
The light-colored stone paths were dyed red with patches of dark blood, and lost souls wandered from place to place, shrieking as the hollows homed in, swarming the vulnerable, newly deceased. A team of Amarini Finley recognized from Psychopomp Drive leaped down from the buildings above, their reapers glowing purple as they dashed through the clouds of smoke and sent the hollows scattering. Finley caught the eyes of a young blonde-haired Amarini amongst them as she ran past him from the cover of the gift shop. Her white ears and tail marked her as belonging to one of Sallow's broodmates, a pale tabby called Breton. Reichardt had once introduced her as Elliot, and she moved with a fluid grace that reflected her years living and working in the in-between. Although she appeared to be in her mid-40s, She had been an Amorini almost as long as Reichardt had. Elliot swiftly changed course when she noticed the black liquid targeting the gathering crowd by the lion's enclosure. As the monstrous inky waves tossed the people into the air, the Amorini leaped after each one of them without hesitation, catching as many of them as she could before they would hit the ground. Once she had planted them back on terra firma, she then urged them to run with a wordless shove in the right direction. The second of Breton's Amorini, a large man with dark skin and bright tattoos, appeared to her left in the smoke, wrangling the king of the jungle back into his cage. The animal snarled and snapped at the spirit, with its eyes wild and staring. Hollows coated its head with tar, stirring something within the beast akin to mania. Saliva poured down from its open jaws, tongue lolling out to one side as it snarled and panted. The hollows, Finley realized suddenly. The hair on the back of his neck and arms standing to attention.
They're infecting the animals.
From the center of the crowd, the humanoid hollow appeared and raised a hand into the air. Purple orbs of light were sent firing in all directions, scattering corpses and debris in their path. Finley rolled out of the way not a moment too soon, coughing as the dust encircled him from the atomized stone. A shout from beyond the far wall had him clambering to his feet again, as a pair of rhinos charged straight through the steel barricade, blood streaming along the ground after them as they continued through the burnt-out ruins of the gift shop and out into the Chester streets.
Oh, shit!
Finley swore as he wiped a hand across his eyes, trying his best to clear his vision. The spell could only do so much. He was hidden, but not safe. All it would take was one well-aimed shot of magic, and he'd be torn to pieces. Green eyes took in the shape of the gathering storm of hollows, and he raced towards them, raising his reaper as he closed the distance. Despite the best efforts of the attacking Amorini, the ghostly shapes of the combining hollows only seemed to grow larger. Their voices were muddled and disjointed where they rained past his ears. He pushed on through the restless spirits and froze in place when the form at the center of the tsunami was revealed to him. Slender and dressed in dark gray, with hair that was as much silver as it was black, stood the form of a woman. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with brown eyes and a confident smile. She was as ethereally beautiful as an angel or a demon. Standing across from her was Elliot, the Amorini holding up the bow that served as her reaper. She was peering at the spirit down the sight of her magical arrow. Her white and tan patterned tail drew nervous circles behind her, and her ears twisted to take in the sounds from both sides of her like a sonar.
"Hello, little kitty,"
the shadowy stranger purred, raising up her glowing hand again.
"Have you come to keep me amused?"
Purple flames erupted along Elliot's bow, illuminating her pale face and hair with magical light.
"Oh, I'm gonna amuse you, all right," she promised,
You've got nowhere left to run, destroyer! The destroyer's smile widened by a few molars.
Destroyer? So that's what they're calling me in the underground, is it?
She cooed. She took a step forward, and Elliot held herself stiffly, preparing to strike. I'm warning you, the Amorini hissed. Take one more step and I'll—
And you'll what?
The woman questioned playfully.
What can you do against a god?
I can do plenty! Elliot roared and fired. The arrows disappeared from view, reappearing all around their target like the hands of a sundial. Elliot raised her free hand and squeezed it into a fist, ordering the makeshift missiles to strike at once. The destroyer rolled, pulling the very darkness around herself like a dense cloak to deflect the attack. She sped through the cloud of amassed hollows to appear in front of the other Amorini, laughing loudly as she yanked her up by both ears, spinning her around in a circle and tossing her back through the rubble. Elliot's back hit a corner of the wall next to her, and she toppled across the ground, bringing flakes of chalk and paint down from the roof after her. She groaned as she got to her hands and knees, shaking herself from head to tail. She let out a choked, wheezing breath, clearly winded. Finley leaped in to intercept the next charge as the tattooed Amorini from before dove in to scoop Elliot up into his arms. A barrage of bullets and projectiles rained down upon the destroyer from the rooftops. Flashes of purple magic signaled the attacks of other Amorini, hiding amongst the rubble. Unfazed by the retaliation, the destroyer extended a hand towards the ground, and her magic fractured the stone into pieces. Long black tendrils reached up from beneath the ground to snatch up the humans and spirits as they fled. The people clawed and screamed as the shadows absorbed them completely, breaking them apart for every last morsel of the soul's energy.
Finley!
Sassy shouted, and he spun to counter the attack, feeling a spike of pain as a sliver of stone continued its trajectory across his cheek. Though it had barely grazed him, the space throbbed.
What the hell is that thing?
One of the humans beside him shouted, his eyes dark and fearful. He tripped as he ran and crawled along the ground, bloody knees scraping over the glass and stone.
They can see the hollows,
Finley realized.
It must be part of the destroyer's magic!
Sassy shouted in alarm.
The humans that come into contact with her must be able to briefly see into the in-between! Look at those humans over there! They're too scared to move!
The humans! Get the humans! The voices cried out from over their heads, spinning round and round in a figure of 8. Finley swept his blade through the ocean of hollows, sending more of the whisperers and corruptors flying up into the atmosphere. There was no time to exercise them now. He could only drive them back and hope he was buying the people enough of a window to retaliate. The buildings and fences around them toppled one by one, unleashing the zoo's menagerie amongst the injured people. African wild dogs howled and barked, whining as they were backed into a corner. prey animals like zebras and elephants stampeded in their panic and crushed survivors underfoot. A staticky wail from beneath him attracted Finley's attention, and he spied a walkie-talkie lying half buried amongst the dead. Reaching down and tugging it from the hand of the unfortunate security guard, his ears perked up as voices began to shout down the line.
The thing is, people, what the is it? There are children. We need to evacuate. Central House. Meerkats!
He searched above the heads of the remaining Amarini for one of the zoo's wooden signs. Spotting a map on one of the remaining walls, he sprinted through the remains of the primary office building, dodging the flailing bodies as they hurried past. Pinned against the wood and plastic, he traced a hand across the surface, searching through the names of each of the exhibits. A picture of a slender-tailed meerkat had him following a trail through bronze-colored stones and sand. Glass littered the pathway where the destroyer had burst right through the indoor enclosure, and pieces of bark poured out from the edges where the animals had escaped, though there were no signs of any of the skinny carnivora that usually occupied the space. Finley had been here often enough to know the building when he saw it. Once upon a time, this had been Thorne's favorite place in the world. Every birthday until she reached adulthood had been spent in the meerkat exhibit, feeding the animals and taking pictures with them. She had even adopted a baby called Wendy when she had turned 13. The meerkat had lived to be almost 17 years old. Finley skidded on the rough ground as he took the next corner at a frantic pace, hands coming to a rest on the red, chalk-like stone that outlined the area where the animals usually played. The dried earth blew apart with every small gust of wind, and the collection of twigs and logs that had once served as the meerkat's playthings were scattered across the neighboring rooftops. Stepping inside the line of broken glass, Finley heard the telltale crunch of it under his boots and scanned for survivors. The earthen hills and man-made caves were vacant, and so too were the areas of shelter that were built to cast a shadow. His ears twitched towards a quiet shuffling noise, and he turned just in time to catch a flash of pink hair.
"Oh no," he begged. "Not here! Not now!"
Caked in dust and dressed in her dark green volunteer's uniform was none other than Rose Daniels. To be continued in Chapter 18.